Okay. So the pronoun. The first thing about a pronoun is the pronoun case. By the way, what is pronoun? Give you some, again, like the idea. Pronoun, like, is the words that take the place of a noun. So you mentioned the proper noun before and you refer back to that proper noun instead of repeating the nouns again and again, you can use a pronoun instead. Different types of pronoun. So you have personal pronoun, you have possessive pronoun, you have like the like that's a pronoun case. You have like the these, that, these, those, they are also pronoun. Relative pronoun is a special one. Like who, whom, which, that, whose. It is also called a pronoun. They are also pronoun as well. But they are different. They are a bit special because they are relative pronoun. They relate to one part of the sentence or another. In other words, it can use this relative pronoun to introduce a dependent clause. So that's something we'll talk about in the pronoun here as well. A very important concept, which is we can use them to introduce the adjective clause. That's something we'll talk about, not today, but in the pronoun session. So it's a very important, another very important concept. We have this kind of pronoun as well. War, another, anyone, they are also pronoun. But when we talk about the first thing about the pronoun case, it's no longer tested on the SAT, on the new SAT. But just give you some ideas. So I will quickly talk about that. Since it's still essential, it's still important, and I don't want you to make this kind of mistake in your writing. So pronoun has different case. They have like the personal pronoun. We're talking about personal pronoun. Only personal pronoun have the case. So here, that's the table here. We have the nominative case, which you can also call the subjective case. I, we, you, and then like their objective case, me, us. It's actually more than that because you have like the subject. When it is a subject, you have to, the rule is very simple. When there's a subject, you need to make sure you use the nominative case. And when it is the object in a sentence, then you need to use this objective case. Other than this subject, nominative, and object, you also have the possessive case, like mine and mine, but they're different. One is the adjective, my things, and mine is already a noun. It's referring to that my thing. I think that's something you already know or think about. So, and the other one is called the myself. That's called reflexive pronoun. This is also like another case of the variation of I. That's reflexive pronoun. Okay, so they are the cases. That's what the case means of the pronoun. Okay, so what kind of mistake you might make? We actually have seen sentences like that before, like here. For example, right? So yeah, we don't have like, so, but remember in the diagnostic test, there are two questions related to this kind of error. So very importantly for now on, like you need to, when you read a sentence, you need to know that here the pronoun is the subject. We use this object like nominative case. And here that's the object. We need to use its objective case. So let me show you we already seen in the subject-verb agreement, we talk about a lot about like how to find the subject. So I think it's very easy for you to identify that the pronoun is the subject in a sentence now. But how about the situation when the pronoun is the object? So pronoun can be the object in two major scenario. The first one is pronoun that come after a preposition. So that's another very important concept, the prepositional phrase. It related to prepositional phrase again. So after the preposition, we mentioned that before, the prepositional phrase, the form is a preposition plus a noun or a pronoun. So at 7 o'clock, between you and me, or between you and I. So that's a question that I usually ask students, like, what do you think? Is it between you and I, or between you and me, or it depends? What do you think? Some students would say, oh, maybe it depends, but actually it's always between you and me. Why? Now I explain to you. So you need to see here, that is a prepositional phrase. Between is the preposition. You and me here, they are the nouns, or they are the pronouns that come after that preposition. So that's a phrase, that's a prepositional phrase. And the rules here is the pronoun and the noun inside that prepositional phrase, or like that comes after that preposition, function as the object of that preposition. So they are actually the object of a preposition. So when it can be an object, when something can be an object of something, it can either be the object of a verb, or it can be the object of a preposition. So there's two scenarios. So you just need to remember that after a preposition, you always use the objective case of a pronoun. I do this for him. No, I do this for he. I do this for you and me. No, I do this for you and I. All right. So because you and me, they are both the object of for, the preposition for here. So, and it's nothing to do with the you and I, or he, or Lily and I. It doesn't matter like what name you put before, or how many people you put in the list. They are all the object. So you have to use its objective case. Does that make sense? All right, so once you remember this rule, right, you remember that like pronouns that come after a preposition are considered objects of the preposition, and take the objective case. You remember these rules, you understand these rules, then that become something like a very normal to you. Everyone did well on the exam except him and her. Is that correct? It is correct, because except is a preposition as well. Him and her, they are the objective case of he and she. So you have to use its objective case, because they are the object of except. So you can consider thinking about like except whom, except what, except him and her. So they are the object. All right, here the same. Sarah left without John and me. Without is the preposition. So after that, John and me, they are the object of without, and it should be the objective case. Between you and me, always between you and me. Between object, that's the preposition. You and me is the object. Okay. So that's the rule. And then you can have a look at question 28. What's the answer? William, what's the answer for this one? Question 28. Between the sales manager and I, is that correct?
Yeah.
It is correct.
Wait, no. And me.
Between the sales manager and me. Is this
Yeah.
an easy cooperative working relationship? Isn't that sales manager and I the subject of this sentence?
Yeah.
They are the subject.
Yeah.
Then that should be an I.
Oh.
So should that be an I or an me?
And I.
Hmm?
And I.
An I?
Yeah.
Okay. Different opinion, different view, or do you see a trick here? Should that be like sales manager and me or sales manager and I? Kathy, what do you think?
And me.
And me? Cindy, do you have an answer?
Or maybe the sales manager and me.
Maybe, not sure. So which one is the subject? So Lisa, do you see the problem here? Or do you also think it might be the sales manager and me?
I think it's me.
Why it should be a me?
Because I don't know what the subject is, but maybe because the sales manager and me, they are both like the objects of like after the preposition.
Between, yes. Right, so that's the rule that I just told you, that I explained to you, like the after between, it should be the object, right? So we should use this objective case. So according to that rule, it should be between the sales manager and me, and always between the sales manager and me, because that's together. That's one thing. That's the prepositional phrase. But the tricky thing here is, so what's the subject of this existed? Is it a sales manager and I? No, it could not be that. They can, like the sales manager and me here now cannot be the subject. Why? Because it's already the object of that preposition, right? And then like we mentioned it before, that's a prepositional phrase. So when you see a prepositional phrase at the beginning of the sentence, and then you see the verb, that's a sign of what? An inverted sentence, remember? So actually you can't find the subject before the verb. So where should we find the subject? Keep looking, right? Look forward. An easy cooperating working relationship. Let's revert it back. So an easy cooperative working relationship existed between the sales manager and me. So that's the sentence structure. So here, the subject, it has a subject that existed, that verb definitely have a subject. But the subject is not within that prepositional phrase, it's not that prepositional phrase, but actually the noun after it. So that's an inverted sentence. So that's a tricky thing. You need to really, again, familiar with all this concept. So when you encounter a sentence like that, you can figure out that by yourself. Oh, that's a prepositional phrase and that's a verb. Where to find the subject, not within the prepositional phrase, not the prepositional phrase, but keep looking the noun after, and then I swap it back, see whether that makes sense. If that makes sense, yes, again, we have an inverted sentence. So inverted sentence is quite common on the SAT. Really, really be careful about that. You definitely need training, of course, and as long as you keep browsing different type of sentence structure and you just get more used to this kind of like special type of sentence structure. All right, so the answer is A. Change it to between the sales manager and me. Always between you and me, or always between you and me. So that's one thing. Another small things for you to give you some idea is sentence like, I am taller than he, or I am taller than him. That's just a question. All right, so you can try to think about that. I am taller than he, or I am taller than him. I think like most of you would say I'm taller than him because that's how we say it, right? But actually right now I want you to tell you that according to grammar rules, formal grammar rules, it should be I am taller than he. I am taller than he. Why? Because the whole sentence, the complete sentence structure is actually I am taller than he is. So that's the sentence structure. Then is very like the key point here, the key thing is here is like, then here is a conjunction. So the sentence structure here is I am taller. That's the main clause. Then he is tall. That's another clause. And that clause is actually describing the tall. So that's the logic here. So how tall? I am taller. I'm taller. How tall? I'm tall. How long? I'm taller. How tall you are? I am taller than he is tall. So you can say like, you perform better than I thought. So here is the same. You perform better than I thought you can perform. You could perform. So actually after then you have a clause. But you can omit that is, because as long as it's like a sort of like you already in the context you already have a verb before, and then that's just using this almost the same verb, and then that the verb in the you don't need to repeat that again. You can omit any repetition part. So that make it a bit tricky. So you can if you read that, why people most of the time say I am taller than him, and then like that become acceptable as well, but different context. In a colloquial, like a daily life, more casual context, definitely people say I'm taller than him, and that's no problem at all. But you need to know the reason. That is because it's just because different, people use that too often, and then that become acceptable. But in the formal context, in that way, people usually can think that then is actually a preposition. So it's like I am taller than him. So use the objective case. But if you look up in the dictionary, then has no function as a preposition. It's only a conjunction. So in the formal context, you need to know that like, actually now they have the preposition case as well, like comparison. But in a formal context, it's still like I am taller than he is. That's the very formal way to write sentence like that, to say sentence like that. But again, you know the rule right now, you know the context right now, you can choose or like by yourself which way you will use according to the context. Okay, so that's another small interesting fact for you. Then we can probably Oh, by the way, like the possessive pronoun, actually, the possessive case is tested more often on the SAT as well. So you need to know that, like, for example, like for the plural, that's the rule I think you already know, but I just give you some, like, just in case. Firstly, like for the possessive case, if the pronoun is, they already contain that possessive case, right? And then for the it, which one is this possessive case? Not this one, not this one, but this one. It's, so you need to remember the spelling or the form. And like this one as well, when you look at the sentence like that, that's a new SAT question. So you can see they actually have a difference here. Another thing about the possessive case is, when it is a plural pronoun, pronouns, it's not about pronoun anymore, it's just pronouns. For example, like individual. If it's singular, then that's individuals. But if it's plural, and that's a plural form. That's a possessive case of a pronoun. So that's another, you probably know, you definitely know, but I just give again, like just clarify that. So when you see the choices like that, you have these two choices. What's the difference between these two? One is singular, one is plural. Then you need to do what? You need to check the context, right? Find out here, should I use individual or individuals? Should that be singular or plural? So that's about non-agreement as well. So that's something you need to consider. You need to check the context and then like to make a decision here. Should that be singular? That's a concept, singular concept or plural concept. Okay. So it's about a possessive case. Let's have a look at this one. This question. Which one? Again, do you understand this sentence? On West 45th Street in New York City, that's a prepositional phrase. Wedge between the buildings more than twice its height. So its height. Whose height? So first, the it here, find the antecedent. For now, every time we see a pronoun, you need to be able to find the antecedent. So the proper noun that it refers to. Here, according to the context, right, stands the lecture theater. You see this one, the verb again, right? So if you, that's firstly two things. Firstly, the wedge between buildings more than twice its height. That's in between two commas. And that's a participle phrase. And in between two commas. Get rid of that. The rest of the sentence still makes sense. What is that? That's an noun essential element. So if you read that sentence along again on West 45th Street in New York City, stands the Lectures Theater. What is that? Which one is the subject? Which one is the verb? Lisa, can you see that? What's the subject? What's the where? Which one is the subject? Which one is the verb?
Is the verb stands.
Yes. Subject?
The build. Actually, it's, I'm not sure. Is it the height.
Height?
um,
No. That's just an interrupter. That's non-essential part. We don't worry about that part. All right. So that's something you need to be careful right now. Like get used to like this kind of like non-essential elements. Okay, get familiar with the non-essential elements. And then here we see this pattern again, right? Prepositional phrase. And then an action verb. So where to find the subject? The noun after it. Revert it back. The Lighthouse Theater stands on West 43rd Street in the New York City. What is it? An inverted sentence again. So see, so that's also an inverted sentence. So that's the subject. That's the verb. The theater stands. So theater is the subject. Stands is the verb. And then that's the prepositional phrase. So what is that wedge between buildings more than twice its height? This is a past participle phrase. So that's a phrase. That's a modifier. The form is down something. It's the past participle function. It is an adjective. Describe something. Describe a noun. And here describe what? It is describing the subject, the theater. It describes the noun right next to it. And here, even it is an inverted sentence, right? So because it is an inverted sentence, so it's actually modifying the subject, the theater. And when it is a past participle phrase, you need to know that the relationship between that action and the verb and the noun that it modifies, it is actually a passive relationship. So the building, the theater is wedged between buildings. So past participle phrase, that's a very important concept. Again, we haven't talked about officially introduced that to you yet because that belongs to the modifier part. But now you have seen that many, many times. You need to try to get your head around this concept, this usage. So if you can look at these two examples, maybe that will give you more idea. The problem caused by the COVID. What does that mean? Why is it caused by the COVID? Because it is the problem is caused by or is caused by the COVID. So why I have to use past participle? Because here I'm talking about it is the passive relationship between the action and the noun that it modifies. The other one, the problem causing some serious discussion. So here causing is like the problem is causing some serious discussion. So if you're not sure, you can mentally adding that helping verb is, you can see whether that it should be used passive or active, whether it's used past participle or active, or the past present participle phrase. It's a very common, we have seen questions like that already, like many, many times. For example, like this one, growing up. So this is a more common participle phrase. I didn't mention that, but you can have a look. Growing up in a family where music was a daily part of life. What is that first part of this sentence? Is that a clause? Nope. It is a phrase. And because it's a growing up, it's doing something. That is a present participle phrase. And what's the function? It is modifying. It is describing Steve and Rick. It is modifying the subject here. So their function is actually an adjective. So that's the grammar structure of this sentence. So we have a participle phrase at the beginning, and then we have the subject, we have the verb. So present participle phrase, why use growing? Because grow and Steve and Patrick, they are like an active relationship, right? They grow up in a family. So we use the present participle phrase. Another very common one, like doing my homework, I watch TV. Doing my homework, that's modifying I. So it's like, I am doing my homework, I watch TV. So now you know the meaning here is like, that's a modifier. It's describing the subject, adding extra information about the subject. Okay, so same as here. So if you know that, like that's the modifier is modifying the theater, then the it's, or should I use singular or plural? It should be singular, right? Its height here is referred to theater's height. Then the answer would be D, not A, because A is not the possessive case. See, that's how you, again, also like how you solve this puzzle. It's not very tricky, but that's a new essay question. So again, you will see this type of like possessive pronoun kind of question on the SAT as well. Very importantly, first thing first, find the antecedent. You know here that refers to what? It's not referring to the buildings, right? It's referring to the theater. That's singular. Okay. Then that's actually sort of like, can be a good transition to the following point we're going to talk about here, the pronoun-antecedent agreement. So that's a very important rules on the SAT, like related to the pronoun usage. So what is an antecedent? So let's introduce that concept again. So antecedent is the noun that the pronoun refers to. So in a sentence, Jamie picked up the ball and threw it. The it here is the pronoun. The ball is the antecedent, right? So the rule here, pronoun-antecedent agreement, we see agreement again. First, number one, you need to make sure what? The number. So singular plural refers to a singular noun, and plural pronoun refers to the plural antecedent. Okay, so that's a very, again, simple rule. So this question is actually about the pronoun-antecedent agreement as well. You can't use plural there. Why it says wrong? That's wrong. The number doesn't agree. Okay. So that's a rule number one regarding the agreement. Pronoun must agree in number with their antecedents. So if the antecedent is singular, the pronoun must be singular. And if the antecedent is plural, the pronoun must be plural. The rule is very simple again. So if you read that sentence, we'll look at some simple sentence first. A student will catch their mistakes if they proofread. Very obviously wrong. A student, there. Doesn't make sense. So a student will catch his or her mistakes if he or she proofreads. That's all singular. Or a very better way, right? Students will catch their mistakes if they proofread. So all plural, then save the trouble. So you know now like you know this rule, and you should be very sensitive to the pronoun in the sentence. All right, and then the first thing you need to check. So remember this, every time when you see a pronoun underline, even it's not in the underlined portion, but in the same sentence, you need to find the reference or like the antecedent. All right, so you need to find the antecedent. So that's the first thing you should do. Let's have a look at question 22. Which one is the answer, or like whether the pronoun is using correctly or not? Is used correctly or not? Yeah, let you have a look first. William, what's the answer? Do you have an answer?
D.
D, correct. Why?
Because it should be plural.
Why should be plural? What's the antecedent?
The girls.
Yeah, could be, right? Could be the drills or the oysters,
Yeah.
right? No matter which one here. By the way, what do you think? If I change it to them, then it refers to what? Oysters or drills? What do you think? Gills, what do you think? Gills or oysters? It should definitely be the oysters. Why? Because you're already using there to refer to the oysters. So you use the same pronoun, refers to the same antecedent. So here, the them here should refers to the day, the same day, and then that's the oysters. Okay. In other words, if you find out here, justify here, that should refers to the gills, the gills, it should change to a different pronoun, or you just repeat that, passing through the gills. All right, so that's something you need to be careful. Another rule of like pronoun usage is like at least in the same sentence, in one sentence, right? In the same sentence, you use the same pronoun refers to the same antecedent. Otherwise, that would be very confusing. Okay. So, but no matter what, they is definitely wrong. So when I mentioned that before, I just want to give you like a clarify here. So remember like the new SAT, you have the choices. So if you see the choices, right, it's like the A have like a A, 8, A is then, and D is. If you look at these choices, right, then you need to know A, B, and C are definitely wrong. But what's the difference between A and D? Then that depends on whether here it should talk about like which one is it, which one like passing through what. So you need to find the context. You need to check the context and have a look, see whether the author here highlight, mention, or emphasize is the gills. Then you know the answer. Okay. 28. Country and Western musicians who in the past were thought to lack market consciousness. So subject, who in the past were thought to lack market consciousness. What is that? That is the adjective clause, modifying, describing the musicians. All right, so we have a look at the adjective clause because that's something we will talk about very soon, and you need to have the idea now, be able to identify that. It's describing the musicians, describing the subject, right? The verb here is now same as one of. Is that correct? One is also a pronoun. and it's singular. So it's related, like it refers to what? The musicians, right? They are now same as. So what's the plural form of one? Should be some of. So the answer is they, and that's how you fix that. So be careful like about this special type of pronoun as well. That's you need to make sure like, but this is one, it's sort of like an agreement as well, like the noun agreement. So they are the corresponding nouns and they should agree in number as well. Okay. 29. Kathy, have a look. What's your answer for question 29? Kathy and Cindy, yes, you can have both, like, or anyone have any idea can tell me your answer.
Maybe A.
A. Why A?
Oh wait. What? Maybe because it says New Jersey's Atlantic City, which is like one, I think. So maybe it should be for its boardwalk.
Are you sure it is singular? City singular? It is definitely singular, right? Why?
Or uses.
You already use singular. So even you're not sure, right? I think it's singular, but I'm not sure. There is evidence, there's clue, there's hint for you to see definitely it is singular. Yeah, but now you know like city is singular. So any noun that if it's no S, is singular, the singular. So it shouldn't be there, it should be it's. Correct. That's it. That's it. That's the reason. So find the pronoun. See the pronoun on the line. Find the antecedent, and then you will find the answer. So very importantly, to be able to identify the antecedent according to the form, according to the meaning. Okay. Let's have a look at the. Have a look at question 14. All right, have a look at question 14. I just get some water. You have a look. All right. So Lisa and William might have a look at this one. Do we have an answer? Is it B correct?
B should be singular.
That's singular. I mean, that's not plural. Will have, that's the future tense. So no matter singular or plural is will have. But is it correct? So this question is, the answer is B. It's about the tense. So you need to, another thing to later on, like we need to train, or you also need to have this kind of skills. Like you need to be able to identify the problem by yourself, right? It's not, no one's gonna tell you that like this question is about pronoun agreement. So you just need to check the pronoun and then like find the agreement issue. You need to be able to identify that by yourself. So but of course, you need to know all the rules first, and then you become very sensitive, very familiar with these rules. So look at it. B answer, right? For very until time zone were standardized in the United States. So that's the past tense, and so the setting of this sentence is in the past, and it's talking about until that time. So it's railway station. You can't use present future tense. You have to use past tense, or past future tense. So each rail station would have to keep several clocks. You can use would have to. That's fine. Or had to. That's fine. Or even had to. That's fine as well. But definitely a past tense. What I want to show you here is the C answer. C answer is correct. It's showing the time of the day. So this usage, why it is correct. Firstly, each here is referring to the clocks. Is it okay? Can I use a singular each to refer to a plural? Yes, because here the each is not like a normal pronoun. Each can just use by itself. So it doesn't have to agree with the antecedent. Right? So it can be just singular. So that's something you need to firstly make sure, like don't take it as a mistake. Another one, showing the time. It's showing the time. What's the usage of this? I just give you some idea first, and then you can, hopefully you can understand. That's not a clause. That's not a clause. So if that's not a clause, so that is right. So sometimes people think showing is not a verb, so that's not a right sentence. The say is wrong. But that's not a clause. That's just a phrase. So you can sort of like understand in this way, like each here is a noun. And then like that showing the time of the day, that is a present participle phrase. Present participle phrase, remember, like the doing something, present participle phrase, modifying the each. So the whole thing is just a noun phrase. Then that a noun phrase or like a positive phrase. Like working, living in Melbourne, for example. Right? So here is the same line. So that's the same similar structure. So that is just giving extra information, additional information of the clocks. So that's the structure of this sentence, and it is correct. All right. So I want to show you the different type of sentence structure and help you to analyze that sentence structure, and you know how to analyze the sentence, identify the sentence structure by yourself later as well. That's very crucial. That's a really, really important skills, because now on the when you do the questions, you will see the sentence structure is it's getting more complicated now. The current trend, so it's getting longer, getting more confusing, more complicated. So you need to be able to identify, understand, analyze the sentence structure by yourself. So that's something very crucial. Okay, then we won't talk too much about the reflexive pronoun, but I will talk about the adjective clause now. So yeah, good. We have time to talk about the adjective clause. So like I mentioned before, you need to know that like the adjective clause is sort of like a knowledge, a package by itself. It's another topic. But why I put it here, why I talk about it in the pronoun agreement, is because that's something you need to consider when you see the adjective clause. But it's more than that. It's more than just a pronoun-antecedent agreement issue. So we sort of use that as a hint, right? And jot that link or link to the adjective clause. So let's have a look at the adjective clause. What is the adjective clause? That's one type of dependent clause. So firstly, it is a dependent clause. And because, or subordinate clause, we call it. And because its function in a sentence is an adjective, so we call it the adjective clause. It has different name as well. Like sometimes people call it like some in other grammar books, they call it like relative clause. That's a just different name, but I think adjective clause makes more sense. That's the function. So before we talk about the adjective clause, I want you to give you some idea about the dependent clause in general. So what is dependent clause? Let me open the PDF file and then like we can have a look together. Give me 1 second. Hopefully I can. Yes, of course. Can I open the file? Yes, great. All right. So what is clause? So remember the first day we talked about word, phrase, clause, and then sentence. So before we talk about a clause at different type, right? They all contain subject and verb, containing a subject and verb. So different from a phrase. Phrase doesn't have a subject verb relationship. So, right, such as in the morning, running down the street, or having that's not a clause. They are not clauses, they are just phrases because there's no subject and verb relationship. Then we say the clause have two types. One is the independent clause or the main clause. The second type is the subordinate clause or the dependent clause. And then we talk about that like how do you know that clause is dependent or independent? It's not according to the meaning, but it really depends on what kind of leading words, transition words you use to set off that clause. If you have no conjunction, like no transition, that's fine. I have a dream, I was late, they are all independent. But if you say because I was late, seems I was late, who is late, right? So this kind of like when you have this transition, like a subordinator, or you have a relative pronoun or relative adverb, then we have the dependent clause. That clause cannot stand alone by itself as a sentence as a sentence. So that's the form. And according to the function, there are three types of subordinate clause or dependent clause, subordinate clause. The first one is the adverb clause. So basically means that it functions as an adverb in a sentence. The second one is the adjective clause, the one that we are going to talk about today. And the third one is a noun clause. So basically you can see here right now, all these phrases, all these clauses, they can only play three functions only in a sentence. Either adjective, adverb, or a noun. And that's it, right? They cannot function as a verb in a sentence. So once you identify that pattern, it makes more sense now. So if you look at the adjective clause, so let's have a look at the adjective clause. these are the clause like give you more example about the dependent and independent. So if you look at the subordinate clause, right, it will follow these patterns. So why either it start with like the coding subordinate, like because, like since, like although, like if, this kind of subordinate. Or it will start with like might start with like the relative pronoun or relative adverb. And then like that would be, that's also like the one type of like dependent clause as well. So this is list of the subordinate, and this is list of the relative pronoun. So who for the adjective clause, we mainly focus on some of them. Okay. And we know that like the subordinate clause cannot stand alone, right? It must attach to an independent clause. Okay. So that's for the clause in general. And then we talk about, let's look at another slide about the adjective clause. So regarding the adjective clause, definition of adjective clause. It's a subordinate clause that acts as an adjective. So it modifies or describes a noun or a pronoun, which is also called the antecedent. So it's also called the antecedent. It's sometimes called a relative pronoun, a clause, because it often begins with the relative pronoun, or this who, whose, whom, which, and that. So they are the signal of an adjective clause. Component. Each adjective clause must have an antecedent, so the noun that it modifies. So you have a noun, and then right after the noun, you will have the adjective clause. The antecedent is the words the clause describe or modify. Or you can think about a pronoun, right? What is the antecedent? Antecedent is the antecedent of the relative pronoun, what the relative pronoun refers to. So if you look at this sentence, for example, to count his angry girlfriend, Joy offer an apology, which Francine did not accept. So do we see the which here? So which is the relative pronoun. And then it refers to the apology. So the apology here is the antecedent. And then the which Francine did not accept, that's a clause. And the function here, it is modifying the apology. So that is the adjective clause. All right, so and in this adjective clause, Francine is the subject, did not accept is the verb, which is actually the object. So this, if you reorder the sentence structure, it's like the Francine did not accept which. Francine did not accept the apology. So that's how that sentence is organized. And it's a very common type of, again, I want you to emphasize here, adjective clause is not something new or very, very high-end kind of like a grammar device. It's very common. You use that every day, probably. But now you know that's actually an adjective clause. Okay. So what we need to pay attention to regarding this adjective clause, firstly, you need to be able to identify that. Remember, like identify that's an adjective clause. So you know from where to where is the clause, and that's an adjective clause, and what does it modify? You can identify all this function. And pattern, right? So they have like the pattern. They can be relative pronoun or adverb plus a subject plus a verb, or relative pronoun as a subject and then the verb. Like that's something we talk about later. But I want you to see more example of this adjective clause so that you just have the idea. So if you look at a sentence like this one, read the examples below and see if you can identify the adjective clause. So the first one we talked about before and already, and then have a look at the second one. We tried our luck at the same flea market where George found Amazing Spider-Man. Here, where is the relative adverb, and also introduce the adjective clause here. Then that adjective clause modify the flea market. The antecedent is the flea market. So that's how that adjective clause function as an adjective modify the flea market. The where here can be replaced with in which, but not just which. So that's something you need to be careful as well. That's something we talk about later. The difference between a relative pronoun and a relative adverb. Okay, again, so read a sentence here. I just give you some idea about the adjective clause. So as I said, this one, Michelle screamed when she saw the spider. That's the main clause. And after that, we have also an adjective clause that then go from the one clean bathroom towel. So that here is the relative pronoun. Introduce that adjective clause and modifying the spider. Can you see that pattern? All right, are you like getting idea about this adjective clause now? Brian said good night to his roommate, Justin, who continued to play video game until his eyes were blurry with fatigue. So here, that who is modifying, that in adjective clause is modifying Justin. So Justin is the antecedent of this adjective clause. So that's the grammar structure, and that's the relationship of, like, that's the logical relationship of this sentence as well. All right. So see the adjective clause. So now we have seen so many examples of adjective clause, I think you have a better idea about what is adjective clause, right? And then we have a look at the grammar rules here and the testing point related to the adjective clause. So first thing, the relative pronoun. All right. So what is relative pronoun? So there's so look at this adjective clause again, right? The concept of adjective clause. There are two ways to introduce an adjective clause. You can either use the relative pronoun, that, which, who, whom, whose, or you can use the relative adverb, when, where, why, whereby. The difference here, one is a pronoun, one is an adverb. What does that mean? All right. So we look at firstly look at the relative pronoun, this first category. So that's the most common one. We use that, which, who, whom, whose to introduce the adjective clause. But the rule number one, the first thing is to check whenever you see an adjective clause on the SAT, or when you write an adjective clause, you need to make sure that the first mistake, don't make the first type of mistakes is to misuse the which and the who. So you need to make sure that, like, you use that, who, whom to describe, and who's to describe people. So here, who, and actually make it more clear, make it like say it clearly. So who and whom can only use to describe people, and which can only describe noun person. So if it's noun person, we have to use which. So that's the first thing you need to be careful, right? So first type of mistakes. If you look at this question 15, I think that's more self-evident if you look at the question 15 then. And we talk about that later. So have a look at question 15. Can you see the problem here? Cindy, can you see the problem?
Maybe it's who instead of which.
The B answer, right? The B, choose B. It should be who rather than which. Why?
Because this has students and they're like human.
Yeah, correct. So that's it. Like the pronoun here is which. The antecedent is the students. They do not agree. Do you see that? So that's sort of like the agreement, pronoun antecedent agreement as well. So that's the reason why I put this adjective clause here, because it's related to that pronoun antecedent agreement issue. You need to make sure that you use, if you see the adjective clause, you write an adjective clause, you make sure you use the right relative pronoun. If it's describing a noun, if a person, a human, you have to use who rather than which. Okay, so that's the first thing. Very silly mistakes, but just be careful about that. So sometimes it get a bit trickier. For example, how about animals? If the antecedent is animals, should you use which or who? So that depends, right? Okay, I will tell you that if it's just normal animals, it's talking about like in the general, like the comparing the species, different species or something there. You use which, because here they're non-human. So this is the same rule, like they're non-human, then we don't use who, we use which. Or alternatively, you can just use that, right? Easier. But you can use who to refer to famous animals. For example, like they're not just animal anymore. They are your pets, for example, they're your family. Then that's a different thing. So it's like sort of like become a human, you humanize those animals. Or like there's these silly characters, right? They're not rabbit, they're Peter Rabbit, they have a name. So in that case, you use who. You treat them like a person. So that's different. But if it's just normal animals, ordinary, usual animals, then regular animals, or we can just, we just use which, okay? So that's something you, about the first rule number one, you need to make sure like you differentiate which and who, they use, like don't misuse them, the agreement things, issues, all right? And that, right? So this, out of these five, that and whose can use in both scenarios, can use to refer to both human or non-human. All good, all fine. Even whose. So as long as it makes sense, you can say like the play. We read one sentence, like we did one of these questions before, right? The playground, whose facilities, something like that. So it's using whose to describe, to refer to the playground. That's fine. All right, that's fine. So whose can also refer to things. So same as of which, like the playground, whose facilities and with asserted the. Okay, so that's nothing wrong. Don't take it as a mistake. Okay, that's a rule number one. Make sure that the pronouns who, which, and that refers to the right types of noun. Okay, it's like the who and which, especially the who and which. That usually is fine. Okay, so which is typically used to incorrectly to refer to people, and who is not used to refer to things. Okay, you need to keep that in mind. That's rule number one. Easier one. And have a look at more questions. All right, have a look at more several questions here. Question 12. Kathy, do you have an answer? Global warming trends, what play a big role? So that should be an active clause as well, right? That's the main clause. Can you see that? So very important, you can identify the adjective clause. From where to where is the adjective clause? So what's the problem? Okay.
What should be that?
Actually here the what should be, we have to change it
Or
to
which? Is it which?
the reason why we can't use that, it's not because all that cannot refer to the trend or something, is another thing. We'll talk about that later, but you can have a look. It's because of the comma. So if you put that adjective clause after a comma, then you can't use that anymore. You have to use which or who. So that's the difference between that and who or which. Most of the case, they are interchangeable. There's nothing like, oh, which is better than that. There's no this kind of rules. But when you put the adjective clause after a comma, like this, it actually, you need to know essentially what did you do? You put it in the non-essential elements. All right, so you actually, when you put a comma here, it's sort of like, so you're actually putting that adjective clause in the non-essential position. So when you put it in a non-essential, after a comma in non-essential position, you cannot use that. If you use that, you have to link closely to the noun that it modifies. So no comma in between. But here, A is wrong, because what is not the relative pronoun here, right? We can't use what to introduce an adjective clause. So that's why A is wrong. Okay, see, that's another type of mistake, another type of question. Can you see the problem here? Can you choose that confidently? And also, can you identify the sentence structure here? That's the main clause. And here, that's the adjective clause in the non-essential elements again. So we have seen non-essential elements quite many times now. Remember that, like anything in between two commas. And if you get rid of that, the rest of the sentence still makes sense. We say that that's a non-essential element. A lot of things can be a non-essential element. Adjective clause is just one of them. So don't get confused of non-essential elements and adjective clause. So non-essential elements is like a sort of like a anything that in between two commas or other punctuation like two commas, and you get rid of the rest of the sentence still makes sense. Then we say that's non-essential elements. Adjective clause is just one of them. Okay. The next one is the relative adverb. So besides the adjective, like the relative pronoun, we can also, sometimes you can see the adjective clause is actually set off by the relative adverb, especially the where. That's probably the most common one. So usually we use when to describe a time. So for example, like which again, see some examples first, get some idea. So spring, for example, like the spring is the season when everything blooms. So that's an adjective clause as well. When everything blooms is describing the season. Where? The house where I was born has been turned into an apartment. So where I was born, that's the adjective clause as well. And this modifying the house. Why? We usually use why. We use why. We only use why to describe reason. So we did not understand the reason why our experiment failed. So that's how you use why. It's not very common, but now you know that's how you use why. And whereby is probably the least common one. Or I'll have a look at the whereby. So we usually use whereby to describe like a system, a process. So a system whereby people could vote by telephone. So what's the difference between this relative adverb and the relative pronoun? So which and so for example, we think about the difference between which and where. What's the difference between which and where? So very importantly, to know the difference is like one is a pronoun and the other one is an adverb. Probably notice here, all this relative adverb can be replaced. It's the same as a preposition plus which. So it's actually the same as a prepositional phrase. And remember, prepositional phrase can function as an adverb. So they're actually the same. So pronoun, so where is the same as in which. So the difference between which and where is actually the difference between which and in which. Okay. We just need to focus on the which and in which, because that's the one thing that usually got tested on SAT. All right, still have no clue why. So what's the difference between which and in which? What I try to say. So let's look at some of the questions here. Some of like one of the sentences here. So sometimes you will see the choices, you might see that they might give you like which, in which, and other choices as well. Then you need to know in that sentence which one is correct. So for example, like this one. The house. Oh, actually, I have it here. You can have a look at this one. Melbourne is the city I live. Melbourne is the city I like. Which one I should use? Where or which for this two adjective clause? So do you see the problem now? They can both modify the city, right? So the first bit of the sentence is the same. Which and where they can both use to. So it's not depends on, oh, is it describing a place or location? And if it's describing a location, then you use where. It's not like that, because here the city, or you can use which as well. It depends on the adjective clause. So what come after. In this, so the crucial question here is, in the adjective clause, do I need that preposition in? So Melbourne is the city in which I live. Right? You can't just say I live which. I live Melbourne. That doesn't make sense. I live in Melbourne. So if you identify that, you figure that out. In this sentence here, I can only put in which or where. But for the second one, Melbourne is the city, which I like. I like Melbourne. I like which. I don't need a preposition here. I can just simply use which, right? So I can't use where or in which, but only which in the second sentence. So Melbourne is the city, which I like. So do you see the difference now? What's the difference between which and where? It's actually the difference between which and in which. All right. And then whether you should use in which or which depends on in the adjective clause. Do I need that preposition? Do I need that preposition? So if you getting some idea, but still not so sure, we can have a look at some other examples, like question 19. Have a look at this one. What's the key? In those cities, which public transportation is adequate? That's a hint. Now you should become very sensitive right now, right? Like which? Okay, that's the relative pronoun. You should introduce an adjective clause. So which public transportation is adequate? Okay, that's to here. That's an adjective clause. What does it modify? Those cities, the antecedent. So the sentence structure, in those cities, fewer traffic problems occurred and pedestrians are rarely involved in accident. So that's the main clause. Here, that's the adjective clause, right? Describing the city, what kind of cities? The cities which public transportation is adequate. So for the B answer here, I check two things. Firstly, I check the antecedent agreement. Can which refers to cities? Fine. That's not a person, not human. So we use which. That's fine. But there's a second thing I have to check as well. Should I use which or in which? So then I need to check what? I need to look backwards. So the first thing I check, I look backwards to check the antecedent agreement. But now I need to look forward to check here in the sentence, in the adjective clause, do I need that in or not? Should I use which or where? What do you think? Should I use which or in which? Any idea? Revert, like try to swap this, like reorder the sentence structure. Public transportation is adequate. The city, those cities. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense, right? So the sentence should be public transportation is adequate in those cities. So here, B is wrong. It should change to in which. Or where. all right, or where. But I want you to know, sometimes people like want to take a shortcut. They just say, oh, it should be where because it sounds correct. I don't want you to do it that way because sometimes it might sound not correct, but still correct. All right, or maybe it sounds correct, but it's actually incorrect. You still need to know the essentially why the reason, the root cause, the why it should be in which. Well, why it should be where, because we need that in. And some students may ask, but here we already have the in. It's saying that in those cities. Do I still need that in here? Do I need that in? Yes. Because the in here is in the main clause. The which can only refer to the noun, but it cannot refer to the noun with that preposition. If you need another preposition, if you need a preposition in the adjective clause, you need to give it one. All right, you need to give it one. So now the sentence, read it again. In those cities in which public transportation is adequate, fewer traffic problems occurred and pedestrian. Now that sentence makes sense. But does that make sense to you? Do you know why we need that in now? All right. So think again, right? Why we need that in? Because in this adjective clause, we need that preposition. We need that in. So it's similar to the first situation, the first sentence here. Melbourne is the city where or in which I live. I can't just say I live Melbourne. I have to say I live in Melbourne. I need that preposition. So this type of questions is like a very tricky one because if you don't know the problem, where the problem is, you don't know what you should look at, you might just simply think, which is fine because it's referring to the city. Okay. So you need to know what is the problem. What is the problem? Okay. Can you do this one correct next time by yourself? Okay, we will have practice. So that's something you need to be careful. All right. So remember the process. So I just said that like for how, when you read a sentence, you need to first step, you need to identify there is an adjective clause. So the adjective clause is tested here. And then you need to check two things. The first thing, look backwards to check the antecedent agreement. That's an easy one. And other than that, and the second thing you need to check is like check forwards. In the adjective clause, should I use which or in which? Just those two things. Okay. You will see more practice in your homework. So you do that later. We'll do that later. But another thing about what I mentioned before, the difference between that and which, all right. But I have to highlight that like this rule only apply to adjective clause. What does that mean? You need to know like that has different functions. That can be a relative pronoun to introduce an adjective clause, but it can also be just a normal conjunction to introduce another, like just a normal clause, not just adjective clause. So here we talk about difference between that and which is only when they are used as a relative pronoun to introduce the adjective clause. So the rule number one, which can preceded by a comma, that is never preceded by the comma. So that's what I mentioned before. So in this sentence, the movie that which opened last Friday, they're both correct. No difference, interchangeable, exactly the same. They both refers to the movie, right? And then like they are the subject of this adjective clause. So which opened last Friday, that opened last Friday, both correct. But if you put them after a comma, if you put the adjective clause after a comma, then you can only use which. All right, does that make sense? So that's a rule. That's a rule you need to remember. I can't explain because that's an idiom. That's how people use that. So that's the difference between the first difference between which and where and that. So after a comma, you can only use which. The second one is after the preposition. So preposition can only be used with which, not that. But again, only in adjective clause. So we mentioned before, like in which, right? Where is the same as in which, but only in which, not in that. So in this sentence, you can only say like in those cities in which public transportation or where public transportation, but you can't say in that public transportation. That would be wrong. Okay. So adjective clause, you can only use preposition. Preposition can only be used with which, not that. Okay. So let's have a look at the question 35, and then like that's the last question that we'll do today. Have a look. That's a new SAT question. Do you have an answer? I have to encourage you to think first, so you know how to do it independently. Is it A correct? But also you need to be able, you see the sentence, right? Like you mentioned before, you need to see that like the sentence is long. You don't just look at the underlined portion, right? You have to read the whole sentence. Remember, that's a very important habit. Every time you see the question 35, even if it's underlined 3 words, the first thing to do, read the whole sentence. Understand the whole sentence, analyze the sentence structure. Then zoom in to look at the underlined portion. Very, very important. So the sentence structure, I guide you to analyze the sentence structure as well to like help you with that. But later on, you need to be able to do that by yourself. So the series recounts the story of the Great Migration. That's a clause. That's a main clause. Subject, verb. The historic demographic shift. That is what? That is a noun phrase. Then after that, during that, I know that's probably an adjective clause, modifying the shift. During that, more than 6 million African American, including the parents, Lawrence's parents, moved from the rural South to the urban North in search for a better life. So the adjective clause come all the way to the end. So I see this sentence structure. That's the main clause. And I have a noun phrase. Again, together with an adjective clause, a very long adjective clause modifying the shift, giving extra information about the shift. And the whole thing here is an opposition, explaining the noun before it, right? The Great Migration. So I understand the meaning. I understand the structure. Very important. That's something you need to, that's the skill and ability, all right, we need to train. Like, and here, so the underlined portion, now we know that's an adjective clause, identify that's an adjective clause. So it's A correct? Is A correct? Can you use that? Why no? Like why, Lisa, why we can't use that?
Is it because it's after the comma?
It is not just after the comma, it is after the preposition. It's after during. So again, right, so the things like, yeah, if it's just right after the comma, then definitely can't use which. But it's after the preposition, you can't use which, you can't use that either. Okay, so why you can't use that? Because it's during that, during which, you can't use, you have to say during which. Okay, so that's the why A is definitely wrong. And B, shift in that, is that correct? Is B correct? Now we don't have the comma, right? Does that make it correct? No. So that's very important to know the reason why it is wrong. It's not because of the comma. You can't use a comma after a preposition. Like you can't use that after a comma. It's like you can't use that after a preposition. So B is still wrong. Is C right? No. That's right after a comma. And I can't use just that. I can't just use which. I need that preposition. I need to say during the shift. Right? I need that preposition. So that preposition is very important. I have to say during the shift, more than 6 million African move from da. So very importantly to see the difference between which. So the answer can only be D. During which, now we don't need to worry about. So it's using which, that's correct. And also very importantly, it's like another thing is you need to know why D is the right answer, because it get rid of that comma now. It is better. We can justify why we should get rid of that comma. With that comma, the sentence is actually like, that's the main clause. And that part is a non-essential. Right? Because it's sort of in between two commas. But now without that comma, the sentence is like, that's the main clause. And everything else, so that's something you need to consider with the comma and without the comma, the difference. Without that comma means that like that adjective was jump right after the antecedent. So that's a whole thing together. That's one thing together. And they are explaining the Great Migration. But if you put a comma, then sort of like that adjective clause is directly modifying the Great Migration rather than the demographic shift. So that small wording difference, the punctuation difference actually change the logic a little, like change your logic as well. And then you need to justify. Here, that adjective clause, which way is better? Should it modify the shift and then the whole idea, sort of like explanation, adding extra information about the Great Migration, right? That would be that's a better interpretation of that sentence. But that's another level, right? That's another level to consider the punctuation issue. But even without knowing that, just apply the simple that and which difference rules, you know, this is definitely the right answer. All the other answers wrong. So that's a question here. So along the way, I will sort of like hopefully like through my eyes, right, get you to read the sentence and then like to show you how to read that and see the difference. You can be able, you will be able to see more from the sentence, like consider more things as well. But definitely that needs a practice. That's not like something you can get it straight away. But but very importantly, you need to try to mimic what I'm doing. I'm demonstrating to you in class how to read that sentence properly, how to analyze the sentence structure, how to identify the main clause, the dependent clause, or the clause. So again, like now think about when you read a sentence, do you identify the structure first, like the from where to where is one clause, from where to where is another clause? Can you like sort of like break it down like the according to the clauses, and then like for each clause, you can identify the subject and verb relationship. So that's something you need to practice as well, like analyze the sentence structure, not just get to the right answer. Okay, so that's this one, the answer is D. The homework for today, and that's for today. And then the homework for today is I will send you the practice, the pronoun practice, and you can finish the pronoun case and the pronoun-antecedent agreement. So the practice here. So you need to finish the page 1 to page 3. Not many, but you need to review first and then do the practice. So not just doing the question, again, very importantly, if you want to get the most out of the course, out of my class, you always need to review first and then do the question. Not just like have class and then like do the practice, do the homework, and then like come to class, all into the come to class. That's not enough. Okay. So that's for you today. Okay. Any question? You can always Google the adjective clause again. Adjective clause is not something just you can see that on SAT. It's not something I made up, SAT made up. It is a very important concept, a grammar concept. So you can Google it. You can self-learn that as well. If you want to know more examples, have a look at more examples. You can always do more self-learn, do some more research as well. And you can always ask me questions if you have any question as well. Okay. So that's all for today. I see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah, bye-bye.